Firstly, I'd like to introduce Professor Sandra Brown, who is a distinguished professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine. And apparently more recently the Vice Chancellor for Research that not only sees her research, which is, I guess, about alcohol and drug abuse across the lifespan, but also more recently been learning about oceanography, apparently. So, but her work this morning is going to be more about developmentally focused alcohol and drug intervention research. So her full abstract is available in the program, so I won't read that all out to you today. But I'd like to introduce or welcome Professor Sandra Brown to the podium.
Good morning, everyone. It's really lovely to be here, and thank you, Dr. Rogers and Dr. Tate, and in absentia, Dr. Butt, for the kind invitation to share some of my research with you. I was particularly pleased to hear the comments earlier about the integration of mental health services and addiction services. There is such a huge comorbidity. And for someone like me who studies addiction from a developmental perspective, it just makes sense. So I am looking forward today to talking with you a little bit about addiction from a developmental perspective and the utilization of new neuroscience and behavioral technologies to help us better understand what is going on in the process of addiction, particularly with regard to alcohol and drugs' effects on the brain, and how we might apply that in the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. It worked. As I got off the plane yesterday, one of the things that struck me was how at home I felt in Perth. I was mentioning earlier that the climate seemed the same as the climate in San Diego, and all of the trees and the vegetation that I first saw were very familiar, many in my own garden and in my own yard at home, and certainly on campus. And the picture you see in front of you is a picture at the University of California, San Diego. It's the iconic library. It was designed and supported by Theodore Geisel, commonly known as Dr. Seuss. And so it has always been, I thought, an omen for me that I should be working at an institution that has a snake winding up the walkway to the library, such a fanciful model and in keeping with the focus on children and adolescents and young adults, which is primarily what I study. And one of the reasons that I'm going to talk to you today about adolescence predominantly is because I think it is such a fascinating period of time in our lives. It is a time, one of the few stages of life that have a biological onset, that is puberty, but has a behavioral offset, that is the accomplishment of the tasks of adult living. And across the lifespan, alcohol affects individuals and drugs affect individuals in very different ways depending on where they are in their development. Adolescence is fascinating not only because of the distinctively different onset and offset, but just what happens in the adolescent years. There are remarkable biological changes. There are remarkable physiological changes, certainly social changes, the transition away from the family and to peers and to becoming an independent individual, an autonomous individual. And in particular, the process of getting there is, I think, key to understanding why so many across industrialized and non-industrialized societies have begin using alcohol or other drugs during this period of time. If we were to look across all species of mammals, we would find some commonalities in adolescence. One of them is increased exploration, that is, extension out of the home environment and out of the family. Another is risk risk-taking. It's critical to success. Some risk-taking is adaptive, and of course, some is maladaptive. But part of that risk-taking in our society and that exploration is reflected in a variety of different behaviors, including alcohol and drugs. And as a consequence, we see different kinds of results from alcohol and drug involvement, whether we're talking about children who may have been exposed in utero, to adolescents and what we see by way of binge drinking, drunk driving, high-risk sex, and escalations in HIV risk. Progressing on to adulthood, when we tend to begin to see some of the medical problems, the pronounced medical problems that many of you treat on a day-to-day basis. And what I'm going to be focusing on primarily today is looking at linkages between this risk-taking, which incorporates alcohol and drug involvement, and some of the consequences that might be biological consequences. In Australia, it's not that different than it is in the United States. Alcohol is the preferred substance. It's used by the largest proportion of youth. In the United States, about 20% of teens in 8th grade are drinking already in the last month. It's half that rate here in Australia. By contrast, by the time youth are in 12th grade, if we just look at past month drinking, there's a steeper escalation in Australia. It's about 60% that report that they have been drinking in the last month, and just slightly less than that in the United States. So it's really obvious that adolescence is a period of time, and this is not lifetime drinking, this is just past month drinking. So the vast majority of adolescents have been exposed to alcohol by the time they graduate from high school. And adolescent drinking is very different than adult drinking. Adolescents tend to drink less often, but at least in the United States, on average, about twice as much as adults do. I'm not sure that parallel holds here in Australia to as great an extent, but it's a remarkably different style of drinking, and I think some of the data I'm going to share with you today will help explain why youth so easily and so quickly gravitate to high-dose drinking as opposed to moderate drinking, which is, of course, what we would all prefer for any youth who is beginning to drink. So one of the reasons it's important to think about alcohol and drug use in the context of development is that there's an awful lot going on during this developmental period. And one area in particular that we think of as so important are the changes that are occurring with regard to the brain. Now, over 10 years ago, there was a pioneering publication that demonstrated change in neural maturation, myelination in particular, over the course of the lifespan. The important thing for us to understand here is that the brain is undergoing major changes, not just in childhood, but in adolescence as well. And in terms of myelination, it moves from the posterior portion of the brain to the anterior portion of the brain. That maturational sequence I like to think of as stepping on the gas first, that is, getting the coordination and affect geared up. Those changes occur first. And then the brakes, the inhibition, which is founded on development of frontal lobes and prefrontal lobes, that's really the brakes. And that occurs later, and in most cases, in the early 20s it is until it is completed. So we have this phenomenon that there is an acceleration in these various components of brain development that I think are keenly tied to experimentation, exploration, and use of alcohol and drugs. This just depicts brain development in a slightly different way. It comes from the Neuropsychology Review just a few years ago. And really what this highlights is that different portions of the brain are reorganizing such that we're not operating as a whole brain system, but rather with regional specification. And this happens both by structural changes and functional changes. And the most important thing for us to walk away with today is to understand that statement at the very top, which is experience-dependent synapse formation and dendritic arboration. Now, what does that mean? It really is a fancy way of saying that what we do, what we practice, what we engage in adolescence, in part determines how the brain develops. Those things that we do repeatedly, alcohol use, drug use, they're going to reinforce certain pathways, neural pathways, in particular reward pathways of the brain and neural networks. Since we lose about 50% of our neural connections over the course of adolescence, and anyone who's raised an adolescent knows that they may have seemed to be well organized as a young child, and they go through this period of disorganization where things aren't quite structured the way that you're used to. There's an explanation for that. And the good thing is that these new processes that unfold in adolescence help restructure the brain so that it operates in a more efficient, faster, more streamlined learning process. So it's a faster learning machine and a more efficient learning machine. And it is in no small part related to the end result, is related to what you engage in adolescence. Now, that doesn't mean that it permanently changes all those connections, but certainly what it does is it lays down certain pathways. And we're beginning to understand this better by newer forms of technology, medical technologies, that we can use to actually look at both the structure of the brain and the brain's functioning. Magnetic resonance imaging is, for example, something that we use in our laboratory a lot. And it helps us know about structures and the way the brain reacts in different situations. But there are newer forms of medical technologies, such as you see in the lower right-hand corner. Those are nanobioengineered patches that are about the size of maybe an inch in diameter. And you can put those on babies' foreheads, you can put them on adolescents' foreheads, you can put them on adult foreheads, and they can read things like heart rate, blood pressure, a variety of measurements of biochemical measurements. And it makes it easy to do now studies that look at human functioning in the natural environment in ways that we never were able to before. Similarly, we're developing behavioral technologies. In fact, many of you may have some of these on your wrists. I don't happen to have my Fitbit with me today, but you might be monitoring how many steps are you taking a day, et cetera. And some of the newer of these models help us understand activity level, things like sleep-wake cycle, which is changing dramatically during adolescence, heart rate, for example. But also there are other technologies. Your phone is now a computer, and we can really monitor where people are when we study them, how close they are to access to alcohol and drugs in their natural environment. And we can text them and see, how are you feeling? Who are you with? What's going on in this situation? And these are the types of things that we're now incorporating into our research. And I thought I'd give you just a few examples of some of the things that we're learning in this process. Over 10 years ago, in the process of studying youth who were in alcohol and drug treatments programs, we came upon a very interesting finding. Youth who had been in controlled environments for at least 3 weeks, where they were monitored daily. So they were abstinent from alcohol and drugs. And they all met alcohol dependence criteria upon entry into the treatment program. But the majority of them had also had exposure to marijuana, stimulants, and other drugs. And we we're studying these youth repeatedly in terms of their cognitive functioning, their neurocognitive functioning. And we selected individuals from the same cities, the same schools that these youth went to, who did not have alcohol and drug problems. They were matched in terms of their gender and their age, their grade, their socioeconomic status, and importantly, the density of their family history of alcohol and drug problems. So these were similar teens, some of whom had problems severe enough to put them into treatment, and others who did not have alcohol problems as of yet. And after 3 weeks of abstinence, we tested again the youth who were in the treatment programs. And what we found was that whether we were giving them tests that measured verbal information, verbal learning, and retention, the kinds of things that students are learning in a language art class, a foreign language class, a geography class, or whether we were testing them in nonverbal domains, visual spatial domains, the kinds of things where they might be learning similarly in school in math or science classes, that even after 3 weeks of sustained abstinence, we identified that even though they learned the same amount originally, 20 minutes later when we tested them, the youth who had a history of alcohol and drug problems were remembering 10% less of the information that they had just learned. So we taught them, we tested them immediately. 20 minutes later, we tested them again, and those who were now 3 weeks abstinent from alcohol or drugs were retaining 10% less. Now, 10% isn't that much, but if you're sitting in a classroom, it's the difference between an A and a B and a C. It's a difference between a C and failing that class. And if you think of this cumulatively, it's 10% less today, and then the next day, that when the classes are contingent on learning from the prior day, they're remembering 10% less. You can begin to see the downward spiral, and why youth who have alcohol and drug problems commonly feel that they may not be as successful in school and don't have the capability. So we thought this was a very, very important finding, and that it had important implications in terms of understanding the long-term effects of alcohol and success of our youth. Now, that's just cross-sectional, right? That's 3 weeks of abstinence. So we wanted to take a look at what happens over longer periods of time. And in our studies, we have the good fortune of doing longitudinal analyses. In fact, we've been funded by the National Institutes of Health to study youth with alcohol and drug problems for over a 10-year period. And first thing we did is we wanted to look at, from middle adolescence to the middle 20s, what were the outcome patterns like for those who had been in alcohol and drug treatment? And we found that it was really quite heterogeneous. That is, some youth did very well. The top trajectory group are those who abstained or hardly used any alcohol or drugs in that 10-year period. Maybe they have an incident here or there, but really nothing on an ongoing basis. The bottom two groups accounted for about 20%, and those were youth who either immediately or very quickly went back to multi-substance involvement, not just alcohol, but other drugs as well. So these would be people that we probably would consider youth as treatment failures, at least for that incident of treatment. And then the other 50% had really markedly varied course after treatment. There were some that in late adolescence in the United States, around the time youth are transitioning out of their home environment, going to school, going off to a first job, going into the military, there was a resurgence in their alcohol and drug involvement. There was another group that continued to do reasonably well, but when they reached that transition period where alcohol is legal, there was an escalation. And then, interestingly, there were about 16% in the population that never returned to substances, even though they had used substance previously, but they just went on to use alcohol almost exclusively. Now, I don't know about in Australia, but in the United States, you'll commonly hear teens say, who were in treatment for multiple substances, well, I didn't get in trouble when I was using alcohol. It was really when I progressed to cocaine or another stimulant or another opiate. So these are youth who transitioned back to alcohol only. And what we did was we began to look at the functioning of these various groups. And I'll show you a picture of how I like to think about them. You have the abstaining group in the upper left. You can see hardly any use over that 10-year period. And these are the average number of times that they used over the course of a 30-day period, the prior 90 days. The abstainers are up at the very top. That's about 30%. Down at the bottom, you see that the heavy users, those that we considered were failures, about 20%. And then we have these three other groups: late adolescent resurgent, young adult resurgence, and the heavy drinkers. We compared them on all sorts of different things. How are they doing in terms of their education? How are they doing in terms of their jobs? How are they doing in terms of new family formation? And how are they doing from a neurocognitive perspective? Now, I bet if I asked you to raise your hand who thought that those on the bottom two categories were performing more poorly across all those domains, everyone would raise their hands, and that would be absolutely right. People who went back to alcohol and drug use very quickly and are using at the levels that you see in that bottom row, they did have a poorer life course. They about half of them ended up in prison at some point in that period of time. It's the middle three groups, the late adolescent abstainers and the young adults and the heavy drinkers, I think that are very interesting, in that those that were heavy drinkers did just as well as the abstainers in educational attainment, occupational attainment, likelihood to get married, in contrast to those that had these resurgent episodes in late adolescence and young adulthood that typically involved other substances as well. And they're kind of that intermediate category. Some had trouble on some domains, some had trouble on the others. But the distinctive thing and the reason that the heavy drinkers were, from my perspective, so seductive is that they don't evidence the kind of developmental problems that we normally look to see whether somebody's successful or not. What they evidence exclusively are a slow increase in neurocognitive impairments. So they look like abstainers on all the other domains, but when you really start to look at how are they performing cognitively, you see a very different picture. In the top slide, these are both memory tasks, just an example. Those two top arches are the community youth who never had an alcohol and drug problems and are abstainers. So the good news is that youth who come into treatment early and are able to abstain are able to return to and function neurocognitively just as though they'd never had an alcohol problem. Wonderful news. The lowest scores are the ones that were for the groups who returned to heavy alcohol and drug use right away. That's not surprising. They had neurocognitive problems evidenced over the course of the 10 years following treatment. But the interesting thing to me is this black dotted line, or the model of the alcohol-heavy drinkers, and how it compares to the other groups that have concomitant drug use. And the finding here is that those who drank alcohol heavily did as poorly or had reduced functioning in the same way as if they had been using other drugs also. And in some cases, worse. In short-term recall, for example, worse than even those who had heavy alcohol and drug involvement. So This is rather frightening. Many of us might think, well, they're just drinking, and they seem to be doing okay in terms of their normal development. But you see this gradual accumulation of neurocognitive consequences that, as we continue to follow them, we anticipate will have a slower and longer-term impact then on their health functioning and their psychosocial functioning as well. Well, we can't give alcohol or drugs to adolescents and then see how they respond to really see, is there an acute impact on the brain. But we can do that to adolescent animals, and there are many people who have done that, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we know from that. In animal studies, we've learned that alcohol exposure produces reduced bone density, adolescent exposure, delay of puberty for females, and a number of brain changes, frontal lobe damage, reduced hippocampal volume, and importantly, slower cellular repair. These types of things really are an indication that exposure in adolescence causes these problems. And what I would like to point out is that these are more pronounced than if the exposure to the animals is during adulthood. So when you compare adolescent exposure to adult exposure, I don't know about the Australian Society, but certainly in the United States and many countries in Europe, we would think that adolescents are immune or more robust, and they have a greater resiliency. And what the animals studies suggested to us is that, in fact, it might be just the opposite, because the brain is undergoing all of these changes and these critical developmental machinations, that it may be a more vulnerable time. We also know that when animals are administered alcohol in adolescence as opposed to adulthood, we see they are not as sensitive to the sedative effects of the drugs. That is, they're more wide-awake drunk rats running around. They are, however, adolescent animals, more sensitive to disruption in memory, impairment in neurotransmission, particularly in the hippocampus and the cortex. And they're more sensitive to social facilitation. That social facilitation ramps up in adolescence. And we see impairment in spatial memory. Could be verbal memory, but we don't know yet how to ask the mice and the rats to respond to questions, so just spatial memory so far. And that looks like that relates to reductions in either release or uptake of certain neurotransmitters. So, of particular importance, I think, because of the way our teens drink, is the fact that alcohol exposure in adolescence, when it's at high doses, something that would be comparable to binge drinking in either of our culture, we see longer lasting effects, not just the effects I just mentioned, but longer lasting effects, particularly in memory and, upon autopsy, damage to frontal and anterior cortical regions. That is, you can actually see the cellular damage if an adolescent mouse is administered alcohol, and then you do the autopsy in adulthood, versus an adult who is administered that same proportion of alcohol, and then you do the autopsy. So there are greater abnormalities. And then finally, for us as clinicians to know that anything that looks like withdrawal is associated with changes in the cortex and the hippocampus. It's actually loss or death of cells. Now, those are the kinds of things that we can measure in adolescence as we observe them from pre-drinking to drinking, or we compare groups who are heavy drinkers and non-drinkers. So, for example, when we look at the prefrontal, the hippocampal volume, that's the portion of the brain that's very important for us in new memory functioning and learning, and a key part of what develops in adolescence. We can see on the right, the red histogram, those are lower, that's a smaller hippocampal volume among youth who have heavy alcohol exposure. And what do I mean by heavy alcohol exposure? It's at least 100 alcohol use episodes. Doesn't matter how much in this study. We didn't trust their self-report. We just said, have you had 100? Those that did were put in that category. So you can see there's reduced physical volume of the portion of the brain that's critical to new learning and consolidation of memory. The frontal cortex or prefrontal cortex, we see these same things, reduced volume. Now this is very important because that's the part of the brain, the last part of the brain that's the brakes, that helps us with inhibition, and what we need for mature decision making and to successfully move into those adult roles. So we've begun to find in human studies the very same kinds of things that have been demonstrated in animal studies where they were deliberately given alcohol either in adolescence or in young adulthood. Now, of course, some of those risks existed before people drank, right? And so if you have poor inhibition before ages 12 or 14, it's more likely that you're going to drink. That's not rocket science. Scientists and clinicians have known this for a long time. We also know that boys and girls react differently, and that it appears that a larger proportion of adolescent girls are impacted deleteriously by alcohol than are boys, and in different ways. Binge drinking with girls is associated with lower comprehension and interpretation of visual information. That's going from non-drinking up to binge drinking. And for boys, we see lower attention, lower progression in attentional abilities. So they look like they're affected in a slightly different way, and it appears to be a slow and cumulative process, just as we saw with those long-term studies of heavy drinking in the clinical populations. Well, it's interesting to know what happens as youth move into the drinking and drug use phase. But if we really want to be sure that this was a function of alcohol or drugs and not a function of something else, we ought to try to stop adolescents from drinking and to see, is there any improvement? This is very important for us from an academic perspective, from a counseling perspective, to know what to expect. And also, when in that drinking continuum, are we able to see this? Is this only for alcohol-dependent adolescents? Are youth affected earlier in the continuum as well? And so we've done these kinds of studies. We've paid adolescents who are binge drinkers to stop binge drinking. And we monitor them on a daily basis, and we ask them to do a variety of different things. Give us urinalyses on a regular basis, text message with us so we can assess what they're doing, where they're at, how they're feeling, etc. And we give them repeated neurocognitive testing. Now, we've done this with 16 to 18-year-olds who were, as I said, binge drinkers. We've compared them to teens in their schools who are not heavy drinkers, but matched in all the ways that I mentioned before: age, gender, grade, socioeconomic status, family history of alcoholism, etc. No one in this study met diagnostic criteria for an alcohol or drug diagnosis. No one met criteria for another Axis 1 mental health disorder diagnosis either. And what do we see? So we see that with binge drinking alone, that is 3 binge episodes in the last month, that was the criteria for our binge drinking group. We can see early on at the first testing time point, which is between 1 and 2 weeks after they stop, that they are still lower in some areas: visual spatial ability, memory, these are just a few, attention, problem solving. And so at the beginning, we see what we saw before with those adolescents who did have an alcohol diagnosis and where we saw that reduction in their performance. However, when we test them sequentially 2 weeks apart, over time, we see that their visual spatial abilities improve quickly, so that by the second time point and the third time point, their visual spatial abilities are comparable to or not significantly different than the community youth, non-binge drinking community youth. The memory skills, however, are slower to recover. They aren't recovering after 2 to 3 weeks like we saw in visual spatial abilities. The long delayed free recall, they're comparable by 5 or 6 weeks, but the short delay free recall, they actually don't match. They don't get back up to what would be normal. And it is this memory pattern of slower improvement in affect that we see via our text messaging, where 90% of the youth that participated in this study responded to us, our prompts, text prompts, even in the classroom, I hate to admit, within a 1 hour period. So over 90% responded within a 1 hour period that we text them. The average length of response time was 2 minutes. And we see that slow improvement of affect over time. Less depressed, less anxious, less irritable, and happier. So that's very nice. Again, it's hard to know what is the chicken and what's the egg, right? What came before and what came after. So the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism has launched something called NCANDA. It's the National Consortium on Alcohol and Neurodevelopment in Adolescents, and we have the good fortune of coordinating this national project. The idea is to look at alcohol consumption, dose, duration, and the timing of that in adolescence to see how it impacts brain structure and function, and to pay attention to the things in development that really matter, as well as looking at their environment, and then looking at a whole variety of different outcomes. We've gathered 830 youth from across the United States, ages 12 to 21. We're using what's called an accelerated longitudinal design, and we'll be testing them every year for 3 years, with the expectation, frankly, that NIAAA will continue to fund us. This next slide just shows you the people that are involved all around the United States. And again, we have the good fortune of coordinating it in the southwestern corner of the United States, which is where San Diego is, much like where Perth is located in Australia. And across these 5 major sites, we're screening youth through schools. About 15% are volunteering to participate in our project, and of those, by the time we rule out things like braces and piercings and any other diagnoses or medications, so it's a relatively clean sample we're following, we are testing these youth on an annual basis, and then we call them in the middle of the year and do a phone evaluation as well. We have completed the baseline assessment and just completed the 1-year follow-up. We're in the process of evaluating that now, and over 90% of the youth participated in even the neuroimaging component of that. So what do we know so far? Well, it's interesting, even in this clean population, there's a lot of variability in brain functioning and brain structures. We have found that about 10% of the youth exhibit some kind of abnormality or something that's an aberration. We have every single neuroimage read by a clinical neurologist. We're seeing the kinds of age-related growths and pattern that we would expect in terms of brain development, and that moderate to high alcohol drinking youth have smaller, thinner cortices in the frontal, temporal, and cingulate regions. Again, these are the regions that are developing, and youth who binge in this group have thinner frontal and parietal cortices. Again, those are the portions of the brain that are under development and the latter portion of development. So we're very excited about this, and we think that this is going to yield some important results as we now move to the analyses for the 1-year follow-up. But the National Institutes of Health thought that this was such an important national topic that they have launched, under the National Institute of Drug Abuse, a landmark study of 10,000 youth that will be followed over 10 years. And I have to say, we are very fortunate to be following these youth and we're coordinating this, this project as well. It's a different approach. We're starting with a younger cohort so we can see what are the teens like developmentally. We will be taking all sorts of premorbid measures that you can see the domains that are listed here, using some of those medical and behavioral technologies that I mentioned. And this one involves 19 sites across the United States. And the thing I want to say about it is that as soon as we gather the data for this, we have things structured in a way so that it will be open to the research community and they will be able to analyze these data just as soon as we can analyze these data. This open access, I think, is very important. So what does this mean for us in terms of the clinical work that we might do, or policies that we might develop? And I would like to say that I think using this social developmental neuroscience approach, it can inform what we do by way of intervention. Paying attention to the short attention spans of those who are involved in heavier alcohol or drug involvement, the memory issues that they're contending with, and problem-solving deficits that we've identified, says something about what we can do and should do in treatment and in prevention. Also, paying attention to the goals of adolescence, development of autonomy, for example, and the importance of social and social influences in decision-making. And from my perspective, skill development. If you were to ask most developmental neuroscientists how our treatments should be designed, they should be supporting the development of normal brain functioning. And how do we do that? We do that through actual exercises that promote the very skills that youth need to develop in adolescence. This is not a deficit model, it's a skill building model. And we've done this, started this anyway, in school systems where we've done developmental tailoring using some of these neurological findings, and using a motivational enhancement approach which allows and promotes autonomy in decision making. And we don't invite youth in to deal with alcohol and drug problems. We invite them in to deal with problems that they are interested in their day-to-day lives. That is the conflict that they have with their peers, the conflict that they have with their parents, figuring out how to have fun without getting into trouble. And then we've marketed this, open to them at the lunch hours in their high schools, and we're testing to see whether youth will voluntarily come to these interventions, these early interventions. We talk about alcohol and drugs, of course, as part of these problems, but this is like a half an hour session. And then we're looking at some, can we change the way youth are thinking and the aspects of their thinking that lead to decisions about their intentions to use, or whether they're going to cut down or quit drinking, and then ultimately looking at the outcomes. And what we've been able to show is that at every school that we've been in, we've done this locally in metropolitan San Diego, and now we're doing it in 3 states across the United States, that we get about 10% of the kids to come to the sessions at lunch. We have about twice as many who have heavier drinking than is prevalent in that high school population. And that by participating in this, what we call project options, actually they labeled it for us because the original label I gave they thought was pretty lame. And that's why you need to market it appropriately to adolescents. I guess I'm way not cool from an adolescent perspective. But we actually use language that they're comfortable with, examples that they generate in order to make them comfortable. And simply by coming to 1 or more sessions, they report, especially the heavier drinkers report, greater intentions to quit and actual quit attempts, both at 1 month afterwards and 3 months after participating. And this could be a single session they come to. They can come to up to 6 sessions, but they could just come to 1 session. Those youth who come to this project options report at 1 and 3 months fewer binge episodes, a lower average number of drinks, and fewer alcohol and drug-related problems. And remember, from my perspective, the real key is to reduce that heavy binge drinking. And we've also shown that we can change some of those cognitive mediators that we set out to change. So I think with that, this would be a good place to close, and just to thank you all for your attention this morning. It's a real privilege to share with you some of the work that we're doing.